Hello, dear watchers. My name is Lauren Sergi, and this is Pop-Up Rhetoric. If this is your first time here, Pop-Up Rhetoric is where we dig into the tricks and the twists of speeches and debates so that we can see how speakers work an audience's thoughts and feelings. If you've been here before, thanks for tuning in again. I've got a really fun video for you today. Before we get started, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for even more public speaking goodness and to stay on top with all of the great videos I'm making for you. For this video, we are getting into debate territory again. Yes, we are back at the presidential debates, my friends, but this time we are looking at the Carter-Regan presidential election debate of October 28th, 1980. Now, if you are interested in even more context behind this debate or wanting to dig in deeper to the issues that we'll be bringing up, like rhetoric and public speaking, you can find this analysis as well as others in my book, The Handy Communication Answer Book. This is available at a bookstore near you or online through your favorite book retailer. I'll pop some links in the description down below. This was the final debate in the 1980 elections, and the two candidates for the American presidency were coming into this debate from very different positions. Carter had had a tumultuous term as president. He was dealing with a bevy of economic and political problems. There was recession, there was high inflation, there was the 1979 oil shock, the Iranian hostage crisis. All of these would have made for a difficult enough campaign, but Carter kind of added to the difficulties of his campaign by refusing to participate in any debates that also included the independent candidate John Anderson, which meant that he didn't do any debates with the other presidential candidates until this final one on October 28th, 1980. Reagan, on the other hand, was coming into this debate riding a wave of popularity. Voters were pretty sick and tired of the weak economy, of the rising inflation, and to them, Reagan's proposals and his promises of increased government revenue and decreased taxes sounded awfully good. Reagan also had a lot of practiced charisma. He had camera savviness and the audience awareness of an experienced actor. And I believe he really leveraged these traits during the debate. In this debate excerpt, you'll notice that both Carter and Reagan spend a lot of time jockeying for favorable positions within the argument and reframing the issues that they're actually arguing about, putting their own twists on it so that they're able to define the terms of the debate. Now, this is very typical in political debates, and the skill of a debater in framing the issues, in controlling the definitions of the terms, and in twisting the arguments to their favor is really critical to their success. What really jumps out at me in this excerpt is that Reagan is able to constantly nudge the argument in his favor, get it onto the path that he wants it on. And he's able also to reframe the issues and express his opinions in a way that is much more palatable to his audience than the ways that Carter expresses his positions and his opinions. Reagan knows how to give off this memorable, relatable, down-home vibe that makes him really connect with the voters, that lets people feel that he understands them and their problems. Interestingly enough, he also does use a lot of overblown hyperbolic statement that triggers people's emotions, that gets a visceral response going with them. Yet he manages to avoid being so overly dramatic that he loses credibility. And that, I think, is a window into his actor's awareness of an audience's mood and an audience's trigger. Another thing that really strikes me when listening to Reagan was his ability to give off these very memorable, easy one-liners that just stick in your brain and are so easy to repeat. And he delivers them in a very natural way. Now, maybe these were off-the-cuff remarks, off-the-cuff statements. They very well could have been prepared, rehearsed practice statements that he and his team had come up with in advance. Do remember that politicians prepare intensely for these debates. These things are practiced and prepped like crazy. But at any rate, he is able to deliver them in a way that feels very natural. And I think part of that does refer back to his experience as an actor as well. Either way, whether they were off the cuff, whether they were prepared, it's very effective rhetoric, and was very effective rhetoric for him to use in this debate. Carter, on the other hand, was on the defensive through most of the debate. He made the mistake of letting Reagan take control of the argument and of the way that they were defining the issues at hand. Now, while he did attack Reagan's positions, especially the economic positions, he relied more on statistics and data than on emotion and memorable wordplay to get his message across to the voters. And when it comes to debate and political campaigns, appealing to pathos, to people's emotions, is much more effective than trying to rely on cold, hard facts and numbers. We tend to vote more with our hearts than with our heads. It's a reality. In the grand tradition of political debates, the devices that we're going to be focusing on in today's video will concentrate on getting control of the argument by framing and defining the issues, of prodding your audience's emotions to get them nicely riled up and probably a little even scared and anxious about what you're referring to, and of course, shooting down your opponent. Today's rhetorical tools are ANTHORISM, redefining a term or issue to one that's more favorable to you. ANTHORISM is used constantly in debates as opponents try to nudge the debate in the direction they want it to go by telling the audience what the issue is really about. A very clear example of ANTHORISM comes up frequently in gun control debates, where people say that the topic of gun control is really actually about mental illness, because so much gun violence is committed by mentally disturbed people. That ANTHORISM turns the argument away from gun control and onto a different topic, mental health support. APODIOXIS. We've seen APODIOXIS in other pop-up rhetoric videos before, and we're seeing it again today. APODIOXIS is a strategy by which you dismiss a person or a person's argument as being false, wicked, unnecessary, or otherwise absurd. What it is an attack on a person's credibility, an attack on their ethos, and that is a hugely popular and very useful, very effective tool for politicians. Hyperbole, deliberate exaggeration, usually done by using metaphors or especially colorful or emotional language. Often when we talk about hyperbole, we're disparaging it. We don't usually compliment someone for being hyperbolic or admire people who just wantonly exaggerate everything. But when it comes to political rhetoric and debate, it's actually very useful, because when it's done well with tact and subtlety, it whips up people's emotions, especially their anxieties and their fears, and that's what usually gets us casting ballots. Parallelism. Parallelism is using separate clauses, those are chunks of sentences or even full sentences, that are very similar in their composition or structure. This makes expressions sticky. It's classic in one-liners. Parallelism, like metaphor, is a big umbrella term that covers a variety of rhetorical figures. A good example of parallelism is when Hillary Clinton quoted Michelle Obama as saying, "When they go low, you go high." The first and the second parts of that sentence are really similar in their structure, and that makes it easy to remember. Catchphrases, sound bites, and one-liners often use parallelism to make them more memorable and easier for us to repeat to each other. I know it can be tricky to keep all these definitions in your head while watching the video, so I've included them in the description down below. Now let's get ready to rumble and fire up the Regan-Carter October 28, 1980 presidential debate.
The next question is from Harry Ellis to President Carter.
Mr. President, when you were elected in 1976, the Consumer Price Index stood at 4.8%. It now stands at more than 12%. Perhaps more significantly, the nation's broader underlying inflation rate has gone up from 7 to 9%. Now, a part of that was due to external factors beyond U.S. control, notably the more than doubling of oil prices by OPEC last year. Because the United States remains vulnerable to such external shocks, can inflation, in fact, be controlled? If so, what measures would you pursue in a second term?
I'll Again, it's important to put the situation into perspective. In 1974, we had a so-called oil shock, wherein the price of OPEC oil was raised to an extraordinary degree. We had an even worse oil shock in 1979. In 1974, we had the worst recession, the deepest and most penetrating recession since the Second World War. The recession that resulted this time was the briefest we've had since the Second World War. In addition, we've brought down inflation. Early this year, the first quarter, we did have a very severe inflation pressure brought about by the OPEC price increase. It averaged about 18% the first quarter of this year. The second quarter, we had dropped it down to about 13%. The most recent figures, the last 3 months of the third quarter of this year, the inflation rate is 7%. Still too high, but it illustrates very vividly that in addition to providing an enormous number of jobs, 9 million new jobs in the last 3.5 years, that the inflationary threat is still urgent on us. I noticed that Governor Reagan recently mentioned the Regan-Kemp-Roth proposal, which his own running mate, George Bush, described as voodoo economics, and said that it would result in a 30% inflation rate. And Business Week, which is not a Democratic publication, said that this Regan-Kemp-Roth proposal, and I quote them, I think, was completely irresponsible and would result in inflationary pressures which would destroy this nation. So our proposals are very sound and very carefully considered to stimulate jobs, to improve the industrial complex of this country, to create tools for American workers, and at the same time would be anti-inflationary in nature. So to add 9 million new jobs, to control inflation, and to plan for the future with the energy policy now intact as a foundation is our plan for the years ahead.
Mr. Ellis, do you have a follow-up question from Mr. Carter?
Yes, Mr. President, you have mentioned the creation of 9 million new jobs. At the same time, the unemployment rate still hangs high, as does the inflation rate. Now, I wonder, can you tell us what additional policies you would pursue in a second administration in order to try to bring down that inflation rate? And would it be an act of leadership to tell the American people they're going to have to sacrifice to adopt a leaner lifestyle for some time to come?
Yes, we have demanded that the American people sacrifice, and they've done very well. As a matter of fact, we are importing today about 1/3 less oil from overseas than we did just a year ago. We've had a 25% reduction since the first year I was in office. At the same time, as I said earlier, we have added about 9 million net new jobs in that period of time, a record never before achieved. Also, the new energy policy has been predicated on 2 factors. One, conservation, which requires sacrifice, and the other one, increase in production of American energy, which is going along very well. More coal this year than ever before in history. More oil and gas wells drilled this year than ever before in history. The new economic revitalization program that we have in mind, which will be implemented next year, would result in tax credits which would let business invest in new tools and new factories to create even more new jobs, about 1 million in the next 2 years. And we also have planned a youth employment program which would encompass 600,000 jobs for young people. This has already passed the House, now has an excellent prospect to pass the Senate.
Now the same question goes to Governor Reagan. Governor Reagan, would you like to have the question repeated?
Governor Reagan, during the past 4 years, the Consumer Price Index has risen from 4.8% to currently over 12%. And perhaps more significantly, the nation's broader underlying rate of inflation has gone up from 7 to 9%. Now, a part of that has been due to external factors beyond U.S. control, and notably the more than doubling of OPEC oil prices last year, which leads me to ask you whether, since the United States remains vulnerable to such external shocks, can inflation in fact be controlled? If so, specifically, what measures would you pursue?
Mr. Ellis, I think this idea that has been spawned here in our country that inflation somehow came upon us like a plague and therefore it's uncontrollable and no one can do anything about it is entirely spurious, and it's dangerous to say this to the people. When Mr. Carter became president, inflation was 4.8%, as you said. It had been cut in 2 by President Gerald Ford. It is now running at 12.7%. President Carter also has spoken of the new jobs created. Well, we always, with the normal growth in our country and increase in population, increase the number of jobs. But that can't hide the fact that there are 8 million men and women out of work in America today, and 2 million of those lost their jobs in just the last few months. Mr. Carter had also promised that he would not use unemployment as a tool to fight against inflation. And yet his 1980 economic message stated that we would reduce productivity and gross national product and increase unemployment in order to get a handle on inflation, because in January, at the beginning of the year, it was more than 18%. Since then, he has blamed to the people for inflation OPEC. He's blamed the Federal Reserve System. He has blamed the lack of productivity of the American people. He has then accused the people of living too well, and that we must share in scarcity, we must sacrifice and get used to doing with less. We don't have inflation because the people are living too well. We have inflation because the government is living too well. And the last statement, just a few days ago, was a speech to the effect that we have inflation because government revenues have not kept pace with government spending. I see my time is running out here. I'll have to get this down very fast. Yes, you can lick inflation by increasing productivity and by decreasing the cost of government to the place that we have balanced budgets and are no longer grinding out printing press money, flooding the market with it because the government is spending more than it takes in. And my economic plan calls for that. The President's economic plan calls for increasing the taxes to the point that we finally take so much money away from the people that we can balance the budget in that way. But we will have a very poor nation and a very unsound economy if we follow that path.
A follow-up, Mr. Ellis?
Yes, you have centered on cutting government spending in what you have just said about your own policies. You have also said that you would increase defense spending. Specifically, where would you cut government spending if you were to increase defense spending and also cut taxes so that presumably federal revenues would shrink?
Well, most people, when they think about cutting government spending, they think in terms of eliminating necessary programs or wiping out some service that government is supposed to perform. I believe that there is enough extravagance and fat in government. As a matter of fact, one of the secretaries of HEW under Mr. Carter testified that he thought there was $7 billion worth of fraud and waste in welfare and in the medical programs associated with it. We've had the General Accounting Office estimate that there is probably tens of billions of dollars that is lost in fraud alone, and they have added that waste adds even more to that. We have a program for a gradual reduction of government spending based on these theories, and I have a task force now that has been working on where those cuts could be made. I'm confident that it can be done and that it will reduce inflation because I did it in California. And inflation went down below the national average in California when we returned money to the people and reduced government spending.
President Carter.
Governor Reagan's proposal, the Regan-Kemp-Roth proposal, is one of the most highly inflationary ideas that ever has been presented to the American public. He would actually have to cut government spending by at least $130 billion in order to balance the budget under this ridiculous proposal. I noticed that his task force is working for his future plans, had some of their ideas revealed in the Wall Street Journal this week. One of those ideas was to repeal the minimum wage. And several times this year, Governor Reagan has said that the major cause of unemployment is the minimum wage. This is a heartless kind of approach to the working families of our country, which is typical of many Republican leaders in the past, but I think has been accentuated under Governor Reagan. In California, I'm surprised Governor Reagan brought this up, he had the 3 largest tax increases in the history of that state under his administration. He more than doubled state spending while he was governor, 122% increase, and had between a 20 and 30% increase in the number of employees.
Sorry to interrupt,
in California.
Carter.
Thank you, sir.
It's Governor Reagan has the last word on this question.
Yes. The figures that the President has just used about California is a distortion of the situation there, because while I was governor of California, our spending in California increased less per capita than the spending in Georgia while Mr. Carter was governor of Georgia in the same 4 years. The size of government increased only 1/6 in California of what it increased in proportion to population in Georgia. And the idea that...
And there you have it. I hope you were able to see just how frequently those two wrestled to frame the argument in their favor. This is why it can so often feel to an audience listening to a debate like the issues that are supposed to actually be argued are never really satisfactorily addressed. It's because the debaters spend so much time just vying for a favorable position and trying to redefine what it is they're talking about. And of course, let's not forget the obligatory mudslinging and emotional prodding. There is a lot of that going on in there as well. Keep these tactics in mind whenever you're watching a debate, and in fact, whenever you're taking in any information coming from a political campaign. Are these people actually addressing the issues at hand? Are they really talking about what they claim to be talking about? Or are they trying to distract us by making overblown, hyperbolic statements intended to scare us, or by calling into question their opponent's credibility? Once again, you can find this analysis and others in my book, The Handy Communication Answer Book, published by Visible Ink Press, who kindly gave me permission to take some of the content from this book and put it in these videos to share with you today. This is like having a communication coach on your desktop and can help us deal with this crazy communication environment we are currently living in. I hope you had as much fun watching this video as I did making it. If so, please hit that like button, and while you're at it, click here to subscribe to my channel. Click up here for more pop-up rhetoric videos, and I warmly invite you to click over here to head over to my website. You can check out my blog, sign up for the newsletter, and find all sorts of great resources on public speaking and communication.